So today's video is going to be another solved true crime case. Today we are going to be talking about the case of Sally Anne Bowman. Quickly before I get into this video, I just want to give my usual disclaimer. I mean absolutely no disrespect to anyone that I talk about in this video. This is all just information that I have found on the internet and I'm compiling into one video. So Sally Anne Bowman was an 18-year-old girl born September 11th, 1987, living in Croydon in London in England. She'd recently moved out of her family house and she actually had her own flat, but she was still really close to her family, especially her three sisters, which her mum says she never went a day without seeing at least one of them. They were really close. Sally was a super talented model, she was a singer as well, and she actually attended the famous Brit School in London for young performers. Brit School alumni includes people like Adele, Jessie J, Amy Winehouse, Tom Holland, Rex Orange County, and so the school obviously saw huge potential in Sally. She was a really talented girl and they thought she was really going to go far in her kind of entertainment career.
Always laughing, giggling, singing. She wanted the fairy tale. She wanted to work hard, you know, be able to support herself financially. Had this little thing that she just wanted to be known. She didn't want to be this big celebrity or anything else, just wanted to be known. And unfortunately now she's very known, but not in the way that she wanted.
She was actually working part-time as a model and part-time as a hairdresser, and she cited her biggest kind of goal in life to be on the cover of Vogue magazine.
Sally's modelling was her part-time job, something that she loved to do, always wanted to do from when she was little. Got the opportunity and took it with both hands, but that was just part of Sally.
In January of 2005, Sally signed to a modelling agency named Pulse, which really kind of propelled her modelling career forward. She became the face of Swatch watches. She was just doing really well for herself. On September 24th, 2005, it was a Saturday and Sally was just kind of kicking about the house all day, just having a kind of lazy day. And she got a call from her sister in the afternoon asking if she wanted to come on a night out because it was one of her sister's friends' birthdays. And so she did. Sally, her older sister Nicole and a bunch of friends all went out drinking in their favourite bar in Croydon named Lloyd's Bar, and they were there until about 1 AM the next morning.
I've seen the CCTV footage. She was at the bar, she was laughing, flicking her hair about, giggling, and according to Nicole, they had an absolute excellent night.
At around 1 AM, Sally and her older sister Nicole got a taxi back to Nicole's house where they were going to sleep over. And the whole time Sally was on the phone to her ex-boyfriend, Lewis Sproston. Sally and Lewis had been together for quite a while and they'd actually only split up a few weeks before this, and so they were still kind of talking, there was still a lot of emotion there, it was still very fresh.
He was your typical teenage boy. You know, he went out to work, he worked. You know, he had a lot of respect for Sally Anne. They were the perfect couple. They were like the Posh and Becks of Surrey. They had their moments. They were teenagers. They used to argue and bicker, but then who doesn't?
Once the girls got to Nicole's house, Sally actually told Lewis on the phone that she was still in Croydon town and that her older sister Nicole had been done for fighting and so she had no way of getting home. So she asked Lewis to come and pick her up from Croydon, which he agreed to. So Sally got a taxi from her sister Nicole's house back into Croydon town centre where she waited for Lewis and then he came to pick her up at around 2:20 in the morning. Lewis drove Sally back to her house at Blenheim Crescent. I think I'm saying that wrong. But anyway, Lewis drove Sally back to her house and the whole time that they were driving, they were arguing. Like I said, this breakup was still very fresh. There was still a lot of emotion there. And so seeing each other just kind of sparked an argument. So they reached Sally's house, but they actually stayed in the car and argued for a further hour and a half, until finally Sally got out of the car and Lewis drove away at about 4 AM. The following morning at around 6:30, one of Sally's neighbours woke up and went outside and saw what they believed to have been a pair of mannequin legs sticking out from behind a skip. So this neighbour went over to see what it was, and there they found the body of 18-year-old Sally Anne Bowman murdered just a few metres from her front door. Sally's body was half naked, it was covered in blood, so it was an obvious murder, and so the homicide team were assigned to this case straight away.
I heard the door knock and I just assumed it would be Sally Anne. I was sort of panicking, thinking, oh God, the door's all locked up, she can't get in. And as I opened the door, there was a gentleman standing in a suit, and sort of took back a bit, and they asked me if I was Linda Bowman, and I said, I am. They said, do you know Sally Anne Bowman? And I said, yes, she's my youngest daughter.
Linda Bowman, Sally's mother, was obviously worried, but she just kind of assumed that Sally had been done for fighting or something. I mean, she'd been out drinking the night before, so she just kind of assumed that maybe Sally had been taken to the police station.
And he said, Linda, Sally Ann's dead, she's been stabbed to death. I just remember screaming, absolutely screaming. I just couldn't believe it. And just my whole world fell apart. So
quickly, police identified their first possible suspect, the last person to see Sally that night, her ex-boyfriend, Lewis Sproston. That afternoon, police went to find Lewis, and he was actually with his friend and his brother at the time. And they just basically approached him and said, are you Lewis Sproston? Now, I don't know Lewis's exact words, but he basically said, yes, he was Lewis Sproston. And then he said words to the effect of, oh, is this because me and Sally had an argument last night? So immediately police felt really suspicious of Lewis. He'd just put himself with Sally just a few hours before her murder, and he said that they'd had an argument. And so this was enough suspicion for police to be able to arrest him then and there.
Here we had someone who had sort of acknowledged that he'd had some form of argument with Sally that night and literally put himself at the scene at the time of the murder. And there is only one way to manage someone like that with an investigation, and that is to arrest them as a suspect for the murder.
But Lewis hadn't yet been contacted with the news of Sally's death. And so when the police said to him, you're being arrested on suspicion of the murder of Sally Anne Bowman, that was the first he knew that his ex-girlfriend was dead. So Lewis was taken into custody and questioned for 4 days. During that 4 days, he also gave a DNA sample so that his DNA could be tested against the DNA that was found on Sally's body. And eventually the results came back.
It was a phone call from the Forensic Science Service. It said, Stuart, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we have a match to the DNA profile from your crime scene. The bad news is it matches to another crime, another sexual assault, 4 years before, only a mile and a half away.
So this meant that Lewis Sproston wasn't Sally Ann's killer, but it also meant that Sally Ann's killer was a serial attacker. Meanwhile, Sally Ann's mother and sister went to go and identify her body.
I'll never forget, I just remember standing in the car park at the back, and you can hear them wheeling her through. For a split second, I thought it wasn't her, because her hair was dark. And then I moved forward, and you just see a little button nose and her little freckles. And that was it.
2 days later, after Sally's autopsy, police went to speak to the Bowman family and just basically tell them the details of how Sally died, like what happened to her that night. So like I said, Sally was murdered on her own driveway, less than 10 metres away from her front door. So her attacker was probably waiting and watching her in the car with Lewis, just waiting for her to get out and for him to drive away so that they could attack her. Sally had been stabbed at least 7 times, many of which actually had exit wounds out of the other side of her body, where these stabs had been so powerful that they'd just gone the whole way through her body. She also had bite marks all over her body, which held DNA of her attacker, which is actually how the DNA could have been tested against Lewis Sproston's.
And then Stuart looked at Nicole and said, in reply to your question, Nicole, yes, Sally Anne was raped. I just remember Nicole screaming, kicking, shouting, trying to calm her down. And then the words were, after she was dead.
The fact that Sally was raped meant that there was DNA evidence that could be tested against other rape/sexual assault cases so that they could see if this person had attacked other women before and maybe if they'd been identified before. And like we said before, the DNA did find a match. However, it wasn't to an identified person. It was a match to an unsolved sexual assault case 4 years earlier in 2001.
A lady who was in a phone box making a phone call when the suspect walks over to her, tries to get into the phone box and masturbates over the phone box.
He manages to get the door open and then ejaculates over the floor of the phone box and then casually walks off across the car park of Tesco's away from her.
And this was an unsolved case for 4 years, despite having DNA evidence of this man. He was just out free after doing this. And so police knew that he was capable of some really dangerous things, especially now that he'd actually murdered a woman. And so police were just really fearful that what else might he go on to do if they don't catch him fast. And so the investigation continued, and just a couple of days later, another attack was reported from the same night as Sally's murder, just a few minutes before. A woman was standing on the side of the street alone. She was on her phone when a lone man came up to her and just said, "I'm sorry." The man proceeded to hit this woman and then get into a kind of altercation, trying to push her over type thing. And that was when a taxi came up the road with its lights on and must have disturbed him, and he ran away. But before he ran away, he actually grabbed this woman's phone, which was still connected to her call.
That person can hear the victim screaming in the background. But what is very frightening and very chilling is that the sounds of the screams don't get any quieter.
Which suggests that lady's attacker, which we maintain, well, I believe, was Sally's murderer, is then hiding somewhere very close by, watching what is going on.
And this victim actually ran up to the taxi driver, the guy that had just disturbed this man, and got into the taxi, and he was able to take her to the police station, where she was able to give a full description of this man, plus make a composite sketch of this man that is also believed to have been Sally's murderer. But even though this man's sketch and his description were plastered all over the news, still no kind of new leads were coming in, and so police had to look elsewhere for clues.
He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot. He's of proportionate build, with short, dark hair.
Police decided that Sally's murderer must live in or have stayed in that general area at the time of her murder. Obviously, because it was in the middle of the night, it was dark, he must have known his way around type thing. And so they just kind of guessed that he lived in that general area. And so police decided to do DNA screening of over 6,000 addresses in that general area, taking DNA samples from every single male that lived in these addresses that kind of fit the description of the attacker. Altogether, this would have been around 4,000 men, and so instead of going to each different man's house individually, they set up a DNA screening centre where the men could just drop in and volunteer their DNA. Obviously, they never expected the murderer to just kind of drop in and give his DNA and give himself up. So they were kind of using this more as either an elimination method to kind of rule out 98% of the general area, or hopefully maybe the murderer had a brother or a dad that would come down and volunteer their DNA, and then they'd be able to find it because it'd be very similar. But still, 6 months after Sally's murder and a large percentage of men was ruled out in the area, they still had no kind of suspects, no leads, nothing. Police had this man's DNA, they had a sketch, a description of him, they had links to other crimes that he'd done, but still they just couldn't seem to find him. And this whole time, a serial attacker was just on the loose, and he'd done things ranging from sexual assault all the way to murder now, and so this was a very dangerous man that was just on the loose this whole time that police couldn't find him. And at this point, he'll be thinking he's gotten away with it. He murdered this girl over 6 months ago, and there's been absolutely no sign of police looking for him. He'll be thinking that he's just completely gotten away with it, and so it'll have boosted his confidence, and maybe he'll be out looking for another victim.
It was the fear of being in your homes at night, locking your windows, bolting your door, jumping every time there's a shadow or there's a noise. And from my point of view as a mum, is he going to get to another one of my girls?
In March of 2006, 6 months after Sally's murder, police decided to release the composite sketch of this guy that attacked the woman in the phone box 4 years earlier. They had already released that sketch of the man that attacked the woman just minutes before Sally was murdered, But even though it was very likely that they were the same man, there's always the chance that maybe they weren't, and maybe they were releasing a composite sketch of the wrong man. But they knew for a fact, because of the DNA matching, that the man in the phone box was the same man that murdered Sally Anne Bowman. And even though this composite sketch was almost 5 years old at this point, and probably very out of date, I mean, people change, their hair changes, things like that, they still thought it was worth putting it out there just in case he was still looking the same as he did 5 years ago. They also decided to go public about the very gruesome details of Sally's murder, something that had just been kept kind of private up until now between Sally's family and the police. The media and the general public only really knew that Sally was murdered. They didn't know anything about the rape. They didn't really know anything. However, police thought it'd be useful to just kind of get out there in the public how dangerous this man is, just in case someone was holding a little bit of a lead but they just hadn't come forward yet. Maybe if they realised how dangerous he was, then more people might come forward with more information. But still, months went by, no significant leads came in, there was no kind of progression made in this case, and Sally's murderer was still on the loose. Then in June of 2006, a seemingly unrelated event and arrest happened in Crawley in West Sussex. A 35-year-old man named Mark Dixie got into an argument and then a fight with a man after watching a World Cup game, and obviously this fight turned into something very violent and he was arrested then and there. He was taken straight to Crawley police station after his arrest, and as soon as his name was entered into the database, they found that he had a really lengthy criminal past. From the age of 16, Mark Dixie had been done for robbery, burglary, assaulting a police officer, indecent assault, indecent exposure, and just several different assault cases. He lived in Australia for 6 years of his life, but was eventually deported back to England after being done for indecent exposure. So anyway, the officers began their kind of standard procedure whenever someone comes into the police station. They just kind of questioned him about this fight that he'd gotten into at the pub. And the officer that was questioning Mark Dixie described him as tearful, which is really strange considering the reason that he was there. It was just a fight. It wasn't really anything too serious. He was gonna get let out in like an hour. Especially when you consider his really like lengthy criminal past. He must have been through this, must have been questioned by police officers several times at this point, like at least over 10 times. And so the fact that he was crying over just a fight seemed really kind of strange to the officers. Anyway, they took his DNA, they took his fingerprints, and he was released an hour later. Like I said, it really wasn't that serious. But then 12 days later, when Mark Dixie's DNA was entered into the DNA database, it flagged up as a match to the DNA that was found on Sally Anne Bowman's body. And in retrospect, that completely explains why Mark Dixie was crying in his interview. He realised that as soon as they took his DNA sample, he was going to be found for murdering Sally and he was going to get put in prison for a very long time. But obviously they didn't find this out for 12 days until this DNA was being put into the database. And in that time, Mark Dixie fled to Amsterdam. He was in Amsterdam for just over 3 months without being found at all. And he actually returned to the UK voluntarily after having an argument with his landlord. He wasn't even brought back over by police. And when he came back to the UK, he just kind of picked up where he left off, got his old job back, got his old life back, lived in the same town. Like, he was just really arrogant, thinking that he'd just gotten away with murder, and he just came back and just lived his life like nothing happened. When he was arrested for fighting, he obviously gave police his home address, the address of his work, like where he worked and everything. And so when police found out that he was back over here in England, they knew exactly where they could find him. They knew that he was a chef at the pub where he worked, and so they knew if they wanted to arrest him while he was at work, they were going to have to get him out of the kitchen, because obviously there's knives and all sorts in the kitchen, so it'd be really dangerous to try and arrest a dangerous man with a bunch of weapons. So the police officers that were going to arrest him were stood outside in the car park trying to devise a plan. They were kind of looking at all of the kind of exit routes that he might have. They were just thinking of a plan stood there in the car park. And then Mark Dixie just steps out of one of the doors right in front of them. And obviously they knew it was him, they knew what he looked like, he was out of the kitchen, it was safe to arrest him, and so they just walked straight over and arrested him then and there for the murder of Sally Anne Bowman.
So I actually put my hand, across his chest to make sure that he didn't run away. I could feel his heartbeat, and his heartbeat didn't even change. I had expected, some form of reaction from him, but I think it really just went to show what a chilling, detached individual Mark Dixie is.
Within hours of Mark Dixie's arrest, police were already going to Sally's family to tell them that they'd caught whoever it was that murdered their daughter. And they actually took a picture of Mark Dixie with them to the Bowman's house so that they could see who had done this. And obviously, as you can imagine, it was really hard for Linda Bowman to look at the face of the man that had killed her daughter. And so it took her quite a while to actually look at this picture.
After a few seconds, I composed myself and I opened it and just saw these big, ugly, bulging eyes and this horrible face, and it was something I didn't know. It didn't make it any easier, to be honest.
Like I said, Mark Dixie did have a really lengthy criminal record. However, all of these offences took place before you legally had to give DNA and things when you were arrested, which is why he wasn't found for so long, because his DNA just wasn't on record. Had this law been in place before now, where he had to give a DNA sample when he was arrested one of those other times, Mark Dixie would have been found and arrested for the murder of Sally Anne Bowman within 24 hours of her body being found. So quickly it was found that the 24th of September, the day that Mark Dixie killed Sally Anne Bowman, it was actually Mark's birthday. And that night he'd been out with friends at a local bar just a few hundred yards from where Sally Anne Bowman lived. He'd been drinking, he'd been on cocaine. However, his friends said that he wasn't overly out of it, he was just acting the same as he always did when he was drunk and intoxicated. What I'm trying to say is that he wasn't acting any differently on this night than he did any other night when he'd take all these substances. Police found from speaking to Mark Dixie's friends and ex-girlfriends and things that he felt that his birthday was a really special occasion. Like, he always wanted a huge celebration, he always wanted all his friends there. His birthday was just a really big day for him. And on this particular birthday in 2005, when they were all drinking at this pub, his girlfriend at the time wasn't actually there with them. I think she was possibly supposed to be coming and joining them later. However, at one point during their night out, Mark Dixie went off on the phone to his girlfriend, and when he came back, his demeanour just completely changed. His friends said that after that, he seemed like he was in a really bad mood, he was really angry, and he spent the rest of the night drinking excessively more than he normally did, and he also took 2 more lines of cocaine. At the pub's closing time, he left with 2 female friends, one of which they were all just going to stay over at her house that night, which was actually only a few hundred yards away from Sally Anne Bowman's house. So the 3 of them went to this woman's flat and they all went to bed at around 2 a.m. And at around 2:30 a.m, Mark Dixie got up and decided that he wanted to go for a walk. He left his friend's flat with a knife. Whether it was hers or his own that he'd been keeping on him all night, no one knows. And so he left his friend's flat with a knife, obviously with the intention of going out and attacking someone and causing some major damage to someone. Obviously, his first victim was going to be that woman who was standing alone on the phone. However, when a taxi came and disturbed him, he started running, possibly all the way to Blenheim Crescent, which is where Sally lived, where he saw Sally in the car arguing with Lewis, and decided to just wait for her to leave the car and attacked her instead. So obviously he waited for Sally to get out of the car, he waited for Lewis to drive away, and then he attacked Sally, stabbed her several times, and then walked away from the murder scene. However far away he went, we don't know, but he did walk away from the murder scene for a little bit. Obviously, because when Sally was attacked and murdered, she was screaming, and so he didn't want anyone to see him. So he went and hid just to make sure that no neighbours came out, no lights came on or anything like that. and when nothing like that happened, he returned to Sally's body to rape her. But what Mark Dixie didn't know was that there was a neighbour watching. She just didn't have her bedroom light on at the time, and so he didn't know. Obviously it was dark outside, so she wasn't able to identify this man at all. However, she said that she did see a man walking in the direction of where Sally's body was eventually found at around 4 a.m. that morning. He then, after brutally murdering and attacking Sally, went back to his friend's house where he was supposed to be asleep on the sofa. He just went back to sleep and woke up the next morning as if nothing happened, completely acted normal with his friends. So Mark Dixie's trial began in February of 2008, and his defence took a really kind of strange approach. He argued that he didn't actually kill Sally. There was another murderer out on the loose that had killed Sally that night, and when he found her, she was already dead. He said he'd been out to buy some more cocaine in the early hours of the morning, and then he found Sally's body on the side of the road. He said that he thought that she was just drunk and passed out, and so he raped her, which I find really hard to believe, and so did the rest of the jury and everyone, because she was covered in blood, she was covered in stab wounds. There was no way that he just thought that she was passed out. Like, she was obviously dead, or at least bleeding out, like dying. Obviously, because he's never admitted to actually murdering Sally, he's also never really given a reason as to why he did it either. Mark Dixie was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 34 years. However, it's really unlikely that he's ever going to get out, because he's just shown how dangerous and how unremorseful he is. After he was convicted for this, UK police got in touch with Australian police. Like I said, he lived there for 6 years of his life, and so they just kind of wanted to get in contact with them to see if there were any unsolved cases over there that they could help solve now that they had his DNA and things like that. Because obviously, as a serial attacker, if he's done X amount of assaults, sexual assaults in the UK, he's probably done some over in Australia while he was there. So they sent Mark Dixie's DNA sample over to Western Australian police, and it was found that he'd committed a very similar attack while he was in Perth. He'd broken into a woman's house, robbed her, raped her, and then stabbed her 7 times. And luckily, this woman survived. She was able to give them a full description of this man. She was able to give them DNA, because obviously he'd touched her. However, they could never find him. And now finally, when they had a confirmed DNA sample from Mark Dixie, they could match it to the one from this crime. However, he's never actually been officially charged with anything to do with this Australian attack. I don't know if he is gonna, maybe sometime in the future, but even if he was, he's still gonna be in prison for the rest of his life. But yeah, that completes this case. I'm really glad that this man was finally found, because who knows what he could have gone on to do. Obviously, he wasn't remorseful in the slightest, never admitted to anything, so he could have gone on to do much worse things if he was never caught. And it's particularly sad as well looking at Sally, because she just had so much potential. You could see it. She was such a talented girl, and it's just really sad that she was taken from us when she was just 18 years old. But yeah, that completes this case. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a thumbs up on it, because that really helps me out. Subscribe down below if you want to see some more content like this from me, because I'm trying to upload true crime videos a lot more often now. Request any cases you want to see in particular down below in the comments, because I've got 3 that I'm working on right now. Particularly requested cases. You guys have been asking for these for months. And yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.